Okay, so welcome
Sweet.
everyone. Oh, you got that. uh Welcome everyone. Really happy to be here. So thanks Lanya Vanya for the opportunity and for the opportunity for the artist residency. Uh I guess a little bit about myself. My name's Francis Dawson. I've been making music for 7, 8 years now. Mostly electronic music. And I also DJ quite a bit. So if you live in St. John's or you've been around the local music scene, you've probably seen one of my DJ sets or seen one of my live performances with my band CUERPOS. So today we're not going to be focusing on DJing. We're going to be focusing on live performance, which is something that I do with my band CUERPOS. So CUERPOS has been on the go for like 4 years now, I think, 3.5. And it's me and my friend Nadia, and she plays bass and guitar and sings, and I kind of hold down the rhythm section with drums, percussion samples, some bass as well, and then like other kind of uh, effects. So the way I do that is with Ableton Live. And I found Ableton Live to be a super powerful, super great tool for live performance. And I think more people should take advantage of it because it really is. I'm going to sound like an Ableton rep, but it really is a great tool. And live sets can be somewhat stressful because there's a lot of moving parts, but ultimately I found it to be some of the most kind of fulfilling and gratifying live performances I've done have been using Ableton. So all that to say, it's a great piece of software. I think you can do a trial for 90 days for free, and yeah, you can get like a light version, I think, at a pretty accessible price point. Um, so yeah, that's what we're gonna be using today, and that's what you can see on the screen. Um, so yeah, I guess first of all, I'm gonna just quickly talk about like hardware and what I use for hardware for my live sets, and then I'm gonna focus most of the workshop on Ableton itself, so software. But in order to command the software, you don't need hardware. I mean, you could just get up with your computer and like that's actually perfectly fine. But like I would highly recommend getting some hardware that you can control the computer with because um it will just free you up and it's a much more like creative process once you have a controller that you can control Ableton with. Um, and so what I use, and I have it right here next to me, is an Akai APC 40. It's really accessible price point. I think I got mine for $120. Um, but there's a number of different MIDI controllers out there. And also, actually, one step back, since this is an introductory class, someone you might be asking, what is a MIDI controller? Well, a MIDI controller is basically just a piece of hardware that has like knobs, faders, volume sliders, etc. That doesn't produce any audio in and of itself, but you can just use that, uh, use the different knobs and faders and such, and map that to your computer and like trigger samples and sounds on your computer using that controller. So yeah, I would highly recommend getting a MIDI controller if you're diving into live electronic performance. Made my life a lot easier and definitely improved my workflow. One thing that I would look out for live sets, uh, I would highly recommend getting a controller that has volume faders. Uh, that's for two reasons. First of all, you can kind of fix the mix on the fly. So, like the way I set up my live sets is I have it broken into 8 channels, which you can see on the screen here. So I've got it broken into like the core components of the track, and I'll get into that more later. But I've got like one channel for kicks, one channel for closed hi-hats, one channel for open hi-hats, one channel for like random perks, one channel for sub bass, etc. So I would highly recommend getting a MIDI controller that has volume faders, because like I said, you can fix the mix on the fly. Like if the kick's hitting too hard or something, you can rein it in a bit. But also, and kind of more importantly, if you're transitioning between tracks, you're transitioning between different samples, you can do that in a smooth way. And like without the volume faders, it's gonna just sound, if the transitions are just gonna be abrupt. I did it for a while, like when we first started CUERPOS, I just had a Novation Launchpad, which is actually a great piece of gear, but it doesn't have the volume faders on it. And it worked, but like it was definitely some transitions were quite abrupt, quite jarring, kind of catches the audience off guard. So I would highly recommend, when you're looking for a MIDI controller, to grab one with volume faders on it. Knobs are also really amazing for different reasons, and I'll get into that a bit later as well. But yeah, pads, knobs, faders, pretty straightforward stuff. A lot of them have that, but just something to keep in mind. And yeah, like I said, the APC 40s are great. I think I just saw one on Facebook Marketplace here in St. John's for like $100. So pretty accessible price point. So that's one part of my live setup. I also I have an external synthesizer. Right now I'm using the Korg Mini Logue. Hoping to get something else into the setup soon. But I find having like the MIDI controller like playing drum loops and samples live, and then kind of noodling over top with an external like hardware synth. I find that to be a really great combo, because the MIDI controller and like Ableton is kind of the clock. It'll keep the tempo. It's kind of the metronome, but then you have the synthesizer over the top that you can have a lot of fun with and really just improvise on the fly. And that's another really great thing about live sets, is that, not one live set is ever the same. And there really is, like when we play with CUERPOS, there really is a lot of improv that goes on. And I think that just speaks to like the creative possibilities that Ableton allows you. And yeah, so that's kind of my setup. I'm also thinking about expanding that setup a little bit. Like I want to get Roland drum pads, like Roland SPD drum pads, so I can play like trigger drum samples live. I've also seen a lot of people using like external effects boxes for their live sets, so I'm not quite there yet. But perhaps for this summer, as we're gearing up for some shows, I might expand live set to include a couple of those things. So yeah, that's kind of my main setup. Oh, also, kind of got a bit ahead of myself, but if anyone has any questions at any point, like feel free to raise your hand, and if I don't see your hand, just jump in. I want this to be like interactive as much as possible, so please do not hesitate to jump in with a question at any point. Okay, so I'm just going to dive into Ableton, I think, because that's really what I wanted to focus on today. So as you can see here, I've got Ableton open. So for people that are not familiar, this is actually called Session View in Ableton. And over here, if you click this button or if you press Tab, you go into Arrangement View. So Arrangement View is really for composition, whereas Session View, I think well, it is for live performance, but I find it really excellent for that, and also really excellent for coming up with loops and ideas quickly. So that's what I use when I'm doing lives. I think I have seen other people use Arrangement View for lives, but I would highly recommend Session View. And that's what this is designed for. And it's in the name, Ableton Live. Like, it is designed for live sets. So I would recommend this. So yeah, let's just dive into it. Basically what I do, so just to give you a really basic schematic of the way I organize my live sets, is I break down, as you can see, the columns. each kind of read like one component. So I break down the columns. I break down each of my tracks into the core components, and I organize those by column, and then I'll have the tracks lined up by row. So as you can see across the top in the columns, I have kicks, closed hats, open hats, perks, bass, guitar pad, synth loops, miscellaneous. And these categories are not like set in stone. It's just like just to give me just to help me organize basically. And then as you can see over here on the right hand side, I've got Disque, Cico, Amazonas, Lámpara. Like those are the names of the tracks. So that's the way I kind of have it divided. I think I've seen people do it slightly differently. This is just the way it makes sense for me, because having it this way, and then having everything mapped to your MIDI controller means that you can mix and match different parts from different songs. So for example, I could play the kick drum from the second track, and I could play the perks from the first track. But when we made those tracks, Disque and Psicotropical, they're two separate tracks, right? And that's where it starts to get really fun and really crazy, is when you start mixing and mashing like the different components from different tracks. So yeah, I like to set the columns like that. And a little trick that I like doing in Ableton is I like to color coordinate, because it helps me stay organized. I don't know if other people are like this, probably, but I like to organize everything by color. And a quick little trick that I've found, if you just select you can select any color here, and then you can just assign that track color to your clips. So if you want it to be like yellow, you can just click here, assign track color to clips, and then they're all yellow. I find it's really easy to organize things that way. And also, I mean, Ableton is quite modular in that way. Like you can really just move around all the different parameters over here, as well. As you can see, you can just like Command R and then just change the name of that. And yeah, so that's kind of like the very basic overview of what I've got going on here. And on my MIDI controller, I've got 8 columns of pads, and I've got 5 rows, and that's why you see this like red box here. And you can on my MIDI controller, I can actually move up and down that box to see like what I want to select. And so everything that's within that red box, I've deemed to be like the key components of that track. So if we start with Disque, for example, which is a track we actually just made to play live. It's not actually recorded anywhere. And we've actually, one interesting thing that we found is we often try to translate a track that we've recorded in the studio into a live performance, and it doesn't work. So what we've actually done is a lot of the times we'll just make a song for a live set. And it's an interesting thing, because then we've tried to translate the song that we made for a live performance into a recorded track, and it doesn't work. So that's another great thing about Ableton, is you can fire stuff up so quickly that you can kind of go into this mode, make a couple quick loops, and if you're playing a show, let's say this evening, we've done this a number of times, you can just get like, there's are not very many components to these tracks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you get 6 components together. You've already got the foundation of a track, and then in the live setting, I might just improvise on the synth. Nadia might play some stuff on the guitar or the bass. So it really doesn't take long to get a track going in Ableton and to transform it into a live performance, which is a really great bonus. Okay, so The next thing I wanted to talk about was MIDI mapping. So this is super important for live performance. And basically what MIDI mapping is in Ableton, you can basically map any parameter within Ableton to your MIDI controller, and then you can control that parameter with your MIDI controller. And so that's what you need to do if you want to use a MIDI controller for a live set. And so how you do that is you go up here into the right hand corner and there's this MIDI button. Click that, everything goes blue. And say I want to automate the BPM. So let's just take this off for a second. So BPM is up here at 106.41, oddly specific. But you just click the MIDI map, click on that, and there's already something assigned to it. So that's why there's a 0.47 there. But you basically click the MIDI map button. Oh, someone wants to get in. Yes. So you basically click the MIDI map button, and then you click on the BPM. And then you just touch whatever knob or fader or pad that is on your MIDI controller. And now that piece of your MIDI controller is now controls that parameter. So basically, if I touch on this BPM piece and then I move this knob, now I can press that MIDI button, and now with this knob I can control the BPM. So for example, if I'm just playing this first track, as you can see, that was a kind of a crazy example because of course I wouldn't want to move the BPM that quickly, but as you can see, now the BPM is mapped to that knob on my MIDI controller. And what I do on my MIDI controller is I have like green painter's tape basically all along it, and then I have each pad like designated for what this belongs to in Ableton. So for that knob, I have a little thing that says BPM knob or whatever. So then what I do, and some MIDI controllers will automatically do the mapping, but a lot don't. And I think it's a good practice to kind of just do it yourself so you can kind of figure out what works for you. So what I'll do is I'll go in to the MIDI map, like again with this blue, and for each value that I want to map. So for example, like I was talking about earlier, I think the volume faders are so essential because once again, it lets you adjust the mix while you're performing, and it also allows you to smoothly transition between tracks. So if I click on that volume fader and then I assign it to that first volume fader, now that the volume fader on my MIDI controller is now assigned to that. And as you can see here, if you go across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, those are already assigned because, I'm already working with this template. But you do have to go through kind of each piece and assign it with your MIDI controller. Okay. So oh yes. So BPM. So let me circle back to BPM for 1 second. So when I was showing BPM, there is one important caveat that you must have. So first of all, I would say, like, if you make a track, let's say at 106 BPM, you're not going to want to go much over or under that BPM when you're performing it live. And that's simply because Ableton Live's warping algorithm starts to get a bit wonky if you go too much over, too much under. So I'd say a good rule of thumb is like give or take 4 or 5 BPM. Like I know like this first track, Disque, I know we made that at 106. So I typically play that at 106, or I might play it at 108. But I wouldn't play it much faster than that. And another important thing is that for all of your clips in here that you've taken from your original compositions, you need to have the warping mode on. So the way I got into this window is I just click on any clip. So this is the disc kick. So this is the kick drum loop that I've got from the song disc. And when you go in here, so it depending on what your preferences are in Ableton, sometimes it automatically warps, sometimes it doesn't, but you must go into the clip and click on warp. And there's some different warping algorithms here. We don't need to get into that now, but you must click on warp and you must click on loop. So loop will just basically repeat it as a loop, pretty self-explanatory, but warp will allow, it's super important because it'll keep the clip in the same key as you increase or decrease BPM. So you need to have warp on. That's a really crucial point. Okay. And yeah. Actually, maybe while I'm just talking about this, it just came to mind. I didn't have it written down, but now that I'm just looking at it, so when we compose tracks and then for a live set, and we've got like 5 or 6 different component pieces, how do we break those into pieces that are manageable for the live set? Well, I often think that less is more for live sets, at least for me. I know some people get like way more intricate with it and incorporate different kinds of gear, but at least for starting out, and even for where I'm at personally, I often think less is more. So as you can see with this one, Disque, I just ripped a 4-bar kick sample, and that's the whole kick drum for that track. But then what I would do is, let's say I'm playing that track. You can haul the track in and out. If you look at the kick drum, I'm playing with the volume fader, right? I'm bringing it in, bringing it out. So I think often what my approach is less is more. Take small little bite-sized loops of your tracks, throw them in Ableton, and then you can quickly like mix and mash on the fly based on what the audience's energy is giving you, based on what your bandmates' energy is giving you, based on the way you're feeling, like if you want to go heavier or if you want to go lighter. And then you can kind of create like really interesting and new possibilities and new permutations on the fly. So that would be my recommendation. I know other people get more technical and more techie with it, which is super cool, and I'm definitely into that as well. But for me personally, what's worked, at least for CUERPOS, is to kind of strip it back for the Ableton template. Kind of keep it stripped back, keep it to its core components, and keep it just like those foundational elements, and then mix and mash those on the fly. Okay, so I'm gonna move into processing now. So on each track, I sometimes do a little bit of processing, and what I mean by that is like additional, like in addition to what's already done in like the project file, I'll add some additional processing onto each channel. And once again, I do often just go by less is more in this as well. But for example here, in the kick, if we just solo the kick, I've got an EQ, like an equalizer on it. Basically, this is just giving it a bit more thump in the low end, carving out a bit here. And you know, this isn't super technical. In other live sets before, I've added a couple other things in there, like some compression, maybe, even a bit of reverb sometimes on the kick. But basically, the way I think about it is that I often heavily process the track in the project file, and then I'll freeze and flatten that audio snippet or that loop, so it'll already have the processing on it, so I don't go too crazy with processing on each individual channel here. I do process quite a bit on the master, but we'll get to that in a second. The one thing I will say though, and to give you kind of a clean mix here, is I would recommend having an EQ, so an equalizer, on each of the channels. So for the kick, I have an equalizer here. I'm just boosting the low end. And then basically for everything else, super straightforward. I just have a low cut EQ. So like for the hi-hats, for example, just cutting out the low end. At a lot of venues, this probably isn't so important, but if you're playing on a like club sound system or like a sound system that has a lot of low end, I think it's like a good idea to do this. Especially because I like to use a lot of like old and kind of dusty drum samples, and a lot of those old drum samples, they have a lot of low end, and it just kind of murks up the low end a bit. So I find, this is really straightforward, but just throwing this low cut EQ on here and just cutting out basically anything below 100 hertz, I think is great. And it'll just kind of clean up the mix a bit. But yeah, once again, nothing crazy going on here. But yeah, I do that for like this closed hats channel, the open hats, the perks, the bass right here. I've got a this EQ. I don't know what's going on with that. This is not my usual template. I just kind of whipped this together quickly for the workshop. But one thing I did include here is a sidechain compressor. And once again, this doesn't really matter a whole lot if you're playing on like a venue that's more oriented towards like a rock band and you're just playing on like a regular PA system. But if you're playing on a club system, the sub bass is super important, and we tend to have quite a bit of sub bass in our music, just to give you that kind of like oomph in the chest, and to really get the dance floor going, which is our MO. So don't need to get too much into it, but if you want to look into sidechain compression, I do find it helpful. So just so the kick drum and the sub bass aren't clashing, I just throw a sidechain compressor onto the sub. Yep. Graham?
Yeah, I was just wondering if all the effects that you're using are these like built-in things that come with Ableton, or are they separate plugins that you've downloaded?
Yeah, these are all stock plugins actually. So EQ8 is stock, compressor is stock. Sometimes I will play with other plugins, but for this workshop, it's all stock. And honestly, Ableton stock plugins are really good. I can't speak of them highly enough. And yeah, so everything you see here is stock plugin.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. So moving into guitar pad. Yeah, so like I said, I just have that low cut EQ on it, just chopping out all the low end, and I basically have that for everything else, and it's very straightforward. Nothing crazy going on. Okay, one thing I actually did want to mention is over here, you'll see this channel, synth external, and it's outside of the red rectangle. So this is not something that I trigger with my MIDI controller, and this is actually taking the sound from my external synthesizer, so my Minilogue, and then I'm processing it in Ableton, and then I'm sending it back out into the room. And the reason I do that is because, well, just to speak to my point just then, is Ableton stock plugins are so good that I like to process them I like to process the synth in Ableton. So on the EQ, I just have like a very simple low cut like everything else, and I have a drum bus. In some other in other live templates, I've had some more things going on, like maybe some light saturation or even like light distortion. But I wanted to highlight the drum bus because Ableton drum bus is so good. Yeah, it's meant to process drums as a whole. It's kind of like a compressor saturator combo. And I don't even know what else they have in there, but just you can throw it on anything. Ableton drum bus, really dope. And so yeah, I got a drum bus on there. It just really gives it like a nice color, gives the mini logo a nice color, and just boosts it. And I also have these one shots here. So for example, if I trigger so what I mean by a one shot is that I'm not going to be constantly playing it, but if I trigger all of the pieces of one track together, then you'll hear it once. So this one, for example, that's just a laser. But if I played them all together, you'd hear it triggered. So one shots are always good to have in there as well. And then finally over here, I have Foley, which is basically just field recordings. I like to put these in my sets sometimes. So this one is just a sample of like a river, I think. And it's running water. It's not playing right now. It's saying my disk. There might be a bit of a CPU issue, maybe because we're recording this, but anyways, it's not important. Basically, I just have the sound of a stream, and I like to have that sometimes in sets. I like to have like the sounds of birds. Actually, as you can see right here, birds, that's a bird sample. Birds, water, anything to give like a bit of texture. I find it really helps just to give like kind of rounds out the sound a bit. For my productions, I use that quite a bit, but I also found for live performance just to have that like kind of bed of sound at the very base level to be really helpful in just filling out and like giving you a full rich kind of sound. Okay. So yeah, I want to talk about the master for a second because I find the master to be really key to my live set. So if you go all the way over here, click on the master. So the master essentially is where all the audio from all these different channels are going. So what I have here is, as you can see down on the bottom, it says CUERPOS Live Effect Rack. So I've basically made an effect rack that has a bunch of different Ableton stock effects in it, and I've mapped that to my MIDI controller so I can then use that during my live performance to be like expressive, to create tension, um, to kind of create buildups, breakdowns, drops, etc. And of course, that's what electronic music's all about: building up tension and then releasing it. So I think this is because I didn't used to have this. This is only since last year. Ever since incorporating this, it's completely changed up our live set and made it, at least in my opinion, so much better. I can't even think about what it was like before because I don't want to, but this is really key. And I don't know where I picked this up, actually. I don't know where this came from, but anyways, it's super easy in Ableton. And basically all you do is, if you want to make one, you can go over here into your library browser, audio effects, utilities, and then audio effect rack. Drop that in. And then you can click on this button at the top, this like circle, and you can kind of delete all these, or you can keep these, like the reverb and the compressor and all that. But I don't have any use for those at the moment. But essentially, what's cool about this is that you can now drop any audio effects into this little box, drop audio effects here, and then map them to these macros here, macro 1, macro 2, macro 3, etc. And then you map that to your MIDI controller, and now all of a sudden you can add like reverb to the entire master of the track, or you can add a high pass filter, which is really common in electronic music, which basically will just take out all the low end. You can add a flanger, you can add delay, dub echo. Like all these things are so essential because they are going to, like I said before, create tension within your performance and then allow you to really build up those sections and then drop it all out. And then you'll have like a satisfying kind of drop or release to the tension. It's also really great for transitioning between tracks. I do it all the time. You know, you just hit it with like a heavy reverb and then fade some sections out, and then you can just bring some a new track in. So let me just demonstrate how I would do that just quickly. So let's grab, yeah, just a regular reverb. So I got the reverb in here now. Decay time, yeah, doesn't really matter for our purposes, but we'll bring the dry wet down. So that's like the amount of effect that's being implemented. And you can right click on that, map to macro 1, and now we've got a reverb on the effect rack. And so, like for example, we just play this. Oh, the audio is dropping out. Probably because we're recording and my computer can't take the CPU. I think I spoke too soon, Sarah, about the CPU. But anyway, basically, you can increase the dry wet here, and that's just going to it's going to add whatever effect. So as you can see, if I increase this macro here, it's just increasing the dry wet of the reverb. So as you can imagine, it'll just it'll wash everything out, add a ton of reverb to your track. And like I said, it's so great when you're when you're breaking it down or you're building it up, or you just want to transition between tracks. It's really awesome. And then yeah, so then you can just minimize that reverb and then just start dropping other things in there. I love having a classic low pass filter and high pass filter. So Ableton auto filter is also great. Drop that in. And this one right here is a high pass filter. And then you just grab the frequency, map it to macro 2. And then I would rename that HPF, high pass filter. And then I would also map the resonance to macro 3. So, and then rename that HPF res. So now you've got, actually, to be even more precise, we can do HPF frequency. So now we've got a reverb, which I'll rename. We've got a reverb on the master. We've got a high pass filter, which is cutting out all the low end. And then we've also got the resonance mapped on the high pass filter, which is really gonna like amplify those peaks and just make the high pass filter more expressive. So let me just close that out for a sec, and I'll just show you my CUERPOS live effect track. So I have that exactly like that. So I've got the high pass filter there with the resonance. I've also got a flanger in there. The flanger, which is right here, it's great. I don't use it that much, actually. I probably could use it a bit more. It can get a bit overdone if you use it too much, but anyway, to each their own. Drive, I love having drive on my master effects rack because sometimes, the track might just not be hitting as hard. You can just hit the drive And basically what I have the drive mapped to, I believe it's in here. Yeah. So within Ableton's auto filter, there's a drive parameter. And basically Ableton's auto filter has a cool function that I think not a lot of people are, maybe people know about, but it's a little slept on. But it's this little like drop down menu here. And usually it's on clean. But if you go down, like for example, MS2, basically Ableton, the engineers or whatever, have created an emulation of the Korg MS2000 filter. So if you use the drive in there, it really gives you like that nice, like saturated kind of old school filter. So yeah, I like to use the drive in that sometimes to really like accentuate certain sections of the track. And yeah, sometimes, if the crowd is really loud and it's getting like pretty rambunctious, you can just turn up the drive a bit and give them, a little bit more, depending on the venue, of course. And then LPF, so a low pass filter, also great. So that's just the opposite of a high pass filter. So rather than cutting out the low end, it cuts out the high end. So really common on a DJ mixer. Also, a lot of these I think are probably from my background as a DJ, because these are really common DJ effects. And then I have a rewind here. That's basically, if you ever seen a CUERPOS set, that's what we do at the end of our sets, like a little one of our gimmicks, I guess. And it's just like this delay, and the way it's set up, it basically just mimics a tape delay. And then finally, I have a dub echo, and that's from Ableton's Echo, also a really great device that you can find up here in delay and loop, Ableton Echo, and there's tons of presets here you can play around with. It's really awesome. So yeah, I got the echo there, I got the feedback, and the dry wet mapped to these two. So yeah, that's the effect rack. And then, so once you've got the map to all these macros, then I'll just map those macros to knobs on my MIDI controller. So then you can basically just apply effects as you like to your master. Okay. And then what else do I have on my master? I've got a drum bus, big surprise, just gives it a bit more boost. I'd probably play around with the presets a bit if this were like a real template that I was going to play with. And then I've got a glue compressor on there that is just kind of catching, as it says, they're catching some of the peaks, but basically just making sure that the volume levels aren't too out of whack between the different elements. Once again, you could put some different things on the master here. Like I said before, kind of opt for a less is more kind of raw approach. Like I try not to get too bogged down in the technicalities and like doing what's right, and I kind of just go with what sounds the best, which yeah, I guess is my approach to production really, and music in general. So yeah, I think that's my main thing. Oh, and one last thing. After you've set up this whole template, you've got your different elements up here on top. You've got your tracks over here on the side. You've got your clips in here. You've got everything mapped to your MIDI controller. Super important. Go up here, live, file, save live set as template. So once you do that, you can save a template, and then you'll forever have this. And then you can just jump into a new session, jump in with new clips, but you've already done all the hard work of like mapping everything to your MIDI controller and like adding EQs to each channel and adding that effects rack that I was just going through to your master, and doing all of that, which is really like the more tedious kind of part. And so once you got that template, you can really just jump in, throw some new loops in there, and just see what comes out. And so that I really love that about Ableton. And if I had known about that sooner, it would have saved me a lot of time. But here we are. I'm sharing some knowledge, and yeah, so I'm happy to know that now. Um, yeah, I think those were the main things I wanted to go through. Uh, I don't know if anyone had any questions or like wanted me to go through anything again a bit more slowly. I know I kind of whizzed through some things there. Um, but we've got some time, so if anyone has any questions or wants to go through anything, just let me know.
Yeah, great. Looks like Graham has a question.
Yeah,
Go for
go
it.
ahead, Graham.
Oh yeah, thanks. Actually, I had a couple questions. The first one is all these effects you're putting on the master, did these all get applied to your external synth as well? Or
Yes,
yeah,
actually. Yeah,
okay.
because and this is where you can differ, or this is where people differ, right? Like I think a lot of people will just plug their synth directly into the soundboard, and they might have some external effects like a guitar pedal or something on that synth. But I personally like to have the synth in the mix and have those effects on the synth, because then you can like, yeah, for example, here I can add like a flanger to the synth, or I can add whatever delay to the synth. But yeah, so for me, that everything that's in Ableton would be affected by that.
So like for you in your live setup, like literally all of the audio is going through Ableton and coming out of there straight into the PA. Is that right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, cool.
And sometimes another interesting thing, I'll something that we've been experimenting with, and this often isn't the often isn't the best way to do it. Well, it's the best in terms of the results. It's sometimes we'll put Nadia's vocal through Ableton. So I'll duplicate this synth external channel, and I'll just set it to a different channel, and then I'll take Nadia's vocal and I'll send it through my computer as well. And the results are often really cool, because now all of a sudden you've got a voice like tangled up into like this whole web of like reverb and delay and like feedback and everything. And the results are really sick, but I have run into CPU problems in the past, and I thought that I was past those because I have a new computer, but apparently not. But that's another cool thing you can play with. Just be mindful of the CPU load sometimes. But yeah.
All right, cool. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, so like you showed at some point one of the kick drum samples you had.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like a pre-recorded sample that I guess you had loaded into Ableton. Can you say more about like where you get these samples from, or like do you like build those in advance and then import them, or are they just like sampled from other recordings, or like where are these coming from in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Um, well, I mean, sample digging is a whole rabbit hole unto itself. Uh, but let me start first with, where did this loop come from? So this loop came from, as you can see here, it says Disque track, or Disque kick. So Disque is a track that me and Nadia made specifically for live sets. So we're like, okay, we need a track that's kind of slow. It's a good intro track. A lot of our tracks are a bit faster, so let's make one at 106. Let's have like certain elements in it that'll kind of like ease people into the live set. Okay, so that's where we started, and I came up with a kick drum pattern, and then I bounced that loop and then threw it into this set. Now, where did I get that kick drum sample to make the kick drum pattern? I don't know about this one in particular, but I have amassed like quite a sample library just from over the years of like digging around on the internet for samples. I mean, you can grab kick drum samples from anywhere. I know Splice is a pretty common program that people use. I used to be subscribed to Splice, but I don't anymore because I just have like a pretty good library now. But even within Ableton, once again, to shill for Ableton, but the Ableton packs, like if you just go to drums, there's just like so many drum kits here that come with Ableton. And I have Ableton Suite, which is the like I guess the pro version, or like the more expensive version. But a lot of packs come with Ableton, and then there's just endless samples there. But also, I would recommend, like, I personally really like sampling, like, or finding like old drum samples from the 90s. Like, you can really, like I said, you can go down the rabbit hole. There is tons of samples to be had out on the internet. So yeah, like just chopping up old drum breaks and then isolating the kick, for example. That's what I often do. Old house breaks or old jungle breaks that were used in the 90s. You can just find those on the internet and import it into Ableton and then just isolate the kick drum. And that's actually what I do for a lot of it. Yeah.
Okay, but this menu you've got up on the left here.
Yeah.
So these are like sampled, like element by element drum kits, is that right? Like
Yep.
one-shot samples that you could then build your own track out of.
Yeah, for sure. So for example, I use this one a lot, 909 chord kit. So it's playing there. But yeah, if you just wanted to insert it, like you just insert a MIDI track, drop that there, and then you got the bass drum right there. And that's just the 909 core kit that comes with Ableton. And then yeah, you got all kinds of stuff. Crash, ride, etc. So that's just like Ableton, I guess, just sampled or just recorded 909, Roland 909, and then made it into like a drum rack instrument in Ableton. So yeah, you can use that. I find those kits are quite good, even though they're fairly like basic. The samples are all quite clean and quite good, and you can dirty them up from there and like make them your own.
And then would you play these samples from your MIDI controller, or kind of like pre-write a part with like build it out of those?
Yeah, I would play those. So like, do you mean in the composition stage or like in the live performance stage?
I guess I'm asking more about the composition stage. If you were to like build a drum part from
Yep.
scratch to then load into your performance, how, like, could you say a bit about how you would do that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I actually use for composition, I often use there's actually a lot of different techniques. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you can just draw them in like this, like as simple as that. And then, super basic, right? But like, you can draw it in like hand like that. I sometimes do a mix of that. I also have an Ableton Push, which is really good for sequencing drums. Because you get it has a step sequencer, which basically shows you all the different steps. You can break it into like 16ths or 30 seconds or whatever. And right here, it's like this grid is broken into 16ths. But yeah, like, oh shit. But yeah, oh damn. Yeah, you can just do it like this. Like, I mean, that sounds terrible, but yeah. So, you can build up tracks like that. Or yeah, using a step sequencer like the Ableton Push. There's a bunch on the market now. Or you can use an external sequencer as well. I don't have any like groove boxes, but people swear by them. So actually, I have used the TR8, like the Roland TR8, and that's really, really good for getting beats going pretty quickly. But yeah.
Cool, thank you. And then like, so with this MIDI track that you've got up right now, would you ever have a MIDI track like that in a live set, or would you export it to its own sample and just play that instead?
That's actually good. That's a good question. For like drums and that kind of thing, I would. So this is something that I like to do. I like to, I'll never have a MIDI clip like this. I'll always separate it. So like I'll just do the kick drum as one. So like I'll start with the kick. So I'll be like, all right, this sounds like a cool kick. And then I'll just keep that as MIDI. and then I'll do the claps, and then I'll do the hi-hats, and then I'll do everything else separately. Because like you process all these elements differently. So the bass drum, for example, has its own processing. The clap has its own processing. The hi-hat has its own processing. So I always want to separate those, and then I will always freeze and flatten and turn those into audio for the live performance. And the reason for that is I just like MIDI, because for MIDI, you have to have an instrument on the rack, because like without the instrument, like MIDI is just information, right? So like if I turned off that instrument, then there's nothing going to sound here. It's triggering the sample, which you can see down there, but because the instrument's turned off, you're not getting anything. So with audio, however, you can have 5 different drum machines or 5 different drum sounds, but all in the same column. Do you see what I mean? So rather than just having the 909 core kit for all the drum sounds, I can instead have, you know, a bigger variety with audio clips. Yeah, so I do know that some people do use MIDI, but I personally just like to use audio for that reason.
So you only use MIDI for like pre-composing things. The final performance is all audio tracks.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Great questions. Actually, and just to quickly add into that, I have used MIDI before, and it's been to sequence the synthesizer. So I'll like make a synth melody or something, or a synth lead using MIDI, and then I'll send that, I'll play it, I'll make a MIDI track and I'll send that to the synthesizer, and then I'll just play with the synthesizer live. So I'll like open the filter, close the filter, like add resonance, etc. Modulate it, whatever. So I have done that before, and I found that's been really, really great. But for drums and stuff, like I'll 100% of the time just bounce it to audio.
So it's only for like, you'd use MIDI to trigger some kind of external hardware, but not within Ableton then.
Exactly. Yeah. But great questions. Thank you. Does anyone else have any
Cool.
questions?
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries.
Cool. Yeah, no, I thought that was an awesome overview of the session view. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. I was happy to do it, happy to be here. And yeah, hopefully everyone learned something at least. Maybe even if it's just one little trick. I hope this was helpful.
For sure. Yeah, and like you said, there's like the 90-day trial, which is a pretty generous trial. And there's also like light versions available, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like limited to 8 tracks. So if you're just like digging in, that could be an option.
Yeah, and I know if you buy certain controllers, like I think if you buy, I bought the Akai secondhand, but I think if you buy certain controllers like the Akai APC 40, I think you can get Ableton Lite for free.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, I know it's the same with the Scarlett interfaces, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sweet.
So and I think there's a couple tiers actually. Oh, and also hot tip, if you're a student, you can get Ableton Suite for like half the price. That's what I did when I was still a student. So hopefully that's still on the go, and hopefully I'm not misleading you there, but
no, I think it is.
Yeah, I think it's like 550 versus 900 or something like that, so definitely worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, thanks again, and we'll be seeing you soon, and thanks to everyone who attended and everyone who's watching after the fact.
Yeah, thanks. See you soon.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks. That was great.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Take care.